Out of all the taboos humanity has created, one stands above the rest: cannibalism. It's more than fear, more than disgust. It's a boundary written into our biology, a rule so ancient that breaking it feels like stepping back into something prehistoric. Yet, history is filled with moments when this boundary shattered, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of belief, sometimes out of pure evil. These events don't exist in isolation. They sink into layers, forming a chilling iceberg of human behavior that most people never dare to examine. Tonight, we're descending into that iceberg. The surface holds the stories you've already heard: famous killers, survival tales, historic tragedies. But below that lie the darker, forgotten cases: rituals, diseases, legends, and horrors that exist at the edge of what we can understand. This is not just a documentary. This is a descent. And it begins now. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's story begins not with violence, but with quietness, an uncomfortable, eerie quietness that followed him throughout his childhood in Ohio. On the surface, his early life looked almost ordinary: a small suburban home, a hardworking father, a mother struggling with her own emotional storms. But beneath that surface were cracks that grew wider with every passing year. His parents fought endlessly, arguments that vibrated through the walls and filled the house with tension that a child could never understand but always feel. Dahmer wasn't physically abused, but emotionally he was abandoned. Left alone for long stretches of time, he became a child who drifted into his own world, silent, overlooked, forgotten. And it's in that silence that something darker began to grow. By the time he was 4, Jeffrey showed a fascination that no one around him understood. While other kids played with toy cars or ran around the yard, Jeffrey was drawn to dead animals on the roadside. He collected roadkill as if it were treasure. He studied their bodies, dissecting them carefully, observing the stillness of death with a curiosity that went far beyond childhood innocence. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't boys being boys. It was the early sign of a mind developing a dangerous comfort with death. But because he caused no trouble, because he wasn't aggressive or loud, no one intervened. No one thought to ask why a young child was spending afternoons examining bones instead of playing with children his age. As he moved into his teenage years, Dahmer became the kind of student most people forget: quiet in class, awkward in conversation, blending into the background like a shadow. But internally, the urge for control, the desire to possess something completely, was growing. He struggled socially, struggled emotionally, struggled with his own identity. And because he couldn't connect with people, he tried to control them in his mind. He fantasized about men he found attractive, but in his fantasies, they weren't equals. They were still, quiet, completely under his power. These fantasies didn't remain fantasies for long. When Dahmer was 18, the fragile stability of his life collapsed. His parents divorced, leaving him in an empty house, alone, unsupervised, disconnected from everything. And in that silence, his darkest thoughts found room to breathe. The moment that changed everything came when Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. At first, nothing seemed unusual: 2 young men talking, drinking, hanging out. But when Hicks wanted to leave, Dahmer felt a familiar panic, a fear of abandonment that had haunted him for years. And that panic turned to violence. He struck Hicks with a dumbbell, killing him instantly. What followed was not the frantic panic of someone overwhelmed by guilt. Instead, Dahmer described the aftermath with chilling calmness. He dissected the body, studying it the way he once studied animals, methodically separating bone from flesh. This was the moment the line was crossed, the moment he discovered a feeling he would chase for the rest of his life: complete, permanent control over another human being. For almost a decade after that first murder, Dahmer drifted through life like a ghost. He joined the army but couldn't follow rules. He worked jobs but couldn't keep them. He tried to straighten out his life, but the urge, the fantasy, never disappeared. It waited quietly inside him, growing stronger with every year. And in 1987, it resurfaced violently when Dahmer killed his second victim, Stephen Toomey. This time, Dahmer took another step into the abyss. He kept pieces of the body. He preserved parts, and eventually, he consumed them. Not out of hunger, but out of a twisted belief that consuming someone meant they would never leave him, that part of them would stay with him forever. It was a horrifying logic, but in Dahmer's mind, it made perfect sense. From that point on, everything escalated. Dahmer's small Milwaukee apartment became a trap that many men entered but never left. He lured them with promises of money, companionship, or photography. Once inside, he drugged them, posed them, experimented on them, and killed them. His obsession with control evolved into something even darker. He wanted living, compliant companions. He began drilling holes into the skulls of his victims, injecting chemicals in an attempt to create what he called a zombie, someone halfway alive, halfway dead, unable to resist, unable to leave. It was as if Dahmer was trying to build human puppets, bodies he could control completely. When these experiments failed and his victims died, he preserved parts of them in jars, stored skulls in cabinets, and kept organs in his freezer. His apartment slowly transformed into a place where life and death coexisted in the most horrifying way imaginable. Throughout all of this, neighbors did notice things. Strange smells coming from his apartment, loud thuds, the metallic scent of something that didn't belong. But Dahmer had a strange gift. He seemed harmless, polite, quiet. He joked with neighbors. He explained smells away as rotten meat or dead fish. And unbelievably, people believed him. Even the police believed him. In the most tragic moment of the entire case, a 14-year-old boy escaped from Dahmer's apartment, drugged, bleeding, terrified. 2 women called the police, insisting the boy was in danger. But when Dahmer approached, calm and soft-spoken, he convinced officers it was a lover's argument. They returned the boy to Dahmer. That decision cost the boy his life. Everything finally ended in July 1991, when Tracy Edwards escaped from Dahmer's apartment and flagged down police. When officers entered the apartment, they found photographs, dozens of them, showing dismembered bodies in various stages. They found bones, organs, preserved heads, and evidence of everything Dahmer had done. It was a scene so shocking that some officers had to leave the room. Dahmer confessed immediately, speaking with the same quiet politeness that had allowed him to escape suspicion for years. He didn't cry, he didn't hide, he simply stated the facts, calmly, as if describing someone else's life. He was sentenced to life in prison, multiple life sentences, but Dahmer's story ended not in a courtroom, but in a prison bathroom in 1994 when another inmate beat him to death. Some saw it as justice, others saw it as closure. But the truth is, Dahmer's story doesn't end with his death. It continues as a haunting reminder of something terrifying. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look ordinary. Sometimes they blend in perfectly. And sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones no one ever suspects.
Andre Chikatilo. Andre Chikatilo's story is one that unfolds like a long, cold nightmare, one shaped by famine, war, fear, and the shadows of a crumbling Soviet Union. To understand how a quiet, bespectacled schoolteacher became one of the most prolific and sadistic killers in modern history, you have to start decades before the murders began, back in the brutal landscape of 1930s Ukraine. Chikatilo was born into a world already filled with suffering. His childhood was shaped by starvation and terror during Stalin's Holodomor, a man-made famine so severe that people whispered about cannibalism in the villages. Whether this happened in his own family is unclear, but his mother often told him that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by neighbors, an image that carved itself deep into his mind and resurfaced years later in his crimes. Growing up, Chikatilo was frail, shy, and chronically bullied. He suffered from bedwetting and other humiliating childhood conditions that left him withdrawn and ashamed. But the greatest wound came from his inability to form relationships. He had a condition that made him sexually impotent, and every rejection, every humiliation fed a growing bitterness inside him. He was a lonely child, then a lonely teenager, and finally a lonely man, silently carrying decades of frustration and rage. On the outside, he seemed harmless, just another awkward Soviet citizen living in cramped apartments, working small jobs, speaking softly and rarely causing trouble. But deep inside, something monstrous was growing, something that had been waiting for the right crack to slip through. That crack appeared in 1978 when Chikatilo lured his first known victim, a young girl named Yelena, into a remote area. He attacked her in a frenzy of violence, stabbing repeatedly, discovering in that moment something that shocked even him. Through violence, through domination, he felt a sense of power he had never known. It awakened something inside him that had been buried for years. The darker truth was that the act of killing brought him a sense of pleasure that normal intimacy never could. The crime was brutal, but the investigation was flawed. Innocent men were questioned, some confessed under pressure, someone else was convicted, and Chikatilo, the real killer, walked away unnoticed, learning a dangerous lesson. He could kill, and no one would suspect him. What followed was a spree that stretched over more than a decade, a trail of bodies spreading across forests, fields, train stations, bus stops, and abandoned Soviet pathways. Chikatilo's victims were often children, teenagers, or vulnerable young women. He targeted those who would be least missed in a society already drowning in poverty and fear. Many were runaways, students, or people traveling alone. He would approach them kindly, offering food, money, or help. Once they followed him into an isolated area, the transformation was immediate. The shy, timid man became something feral, stabbing, slashing, ripping, driven by a sadistic rage he could never control. Many victims were mutilated after death, and several reports state he consumed pieces of their bodies, an act that connected disturbingly with the dark stories his mother had told him in childhood. His killing method became a ritual: lure, isolate, attack, stab repeatedly, mutilate, and sometimes remove body parts. This horrific pattern earned him the nickname the Rostov Ripper. Yet somehow he managed to appear invisible to the authorities. In the Soviet system of the time, serial killers were considered a Western phenomenon, something that didn't happen in the communist world. Because of this belief, investigators were discouraged from even using the term. This denial allowed Chikatilo to hunt freely, while police chased the wrong suspects for years. Dozens of innocent men were interrogated, humiliated, and punished. One man was even executed for a crime Chikatilo committed. The system was so rigid, so unwilling to admit flaws, that the real killer was able to continue escalating while investigators tied themselves in bureaucratic knots. Despite all this, Chikatilo remained outwardly ordinary. He was a father, a husband, and a teacher. Those students found him strange, even frightening. He would sometimes touch students inappropriately, scaring them with his unpredictable behavior. But there was never enough to get him arrested. Instead, he moved from job to job, blending into the gray Soviet backdrop as if he were just another forgettable man in a country full of struggling citizens. His ability to appear harmless was one of his greatest weapons. Nobody looking at him saw a monster. By the late 1980s, the killings were becoming harder to hide. Bodies were found more frequently, often in clusters. The violence was increasing, the mutilation growing more grotesque. Chikatilo himself claimed he couldn't stop, that the compulsion inside him was stronger than any fear of capture. He stalked bus stations, train platforms, and open markets, anywhere he could spot someone alone, someone desperate, someone invisible. His victims ranged from very young children to adult women, the youngest only 7. Every time he killed, he experienced a sickening blend of relief, release, and disgust. He didn't understand why his mind worked this way, but he knew the act itself had become a necessity, something he couldn't resist. Finally, in 1990, after more than 50 murders, the walls began to close in. Surveillance teams were deployed near suspected dumping sites. Officers watched train stations and isolated forest paths, And one day, they noticed a strange man talking to children near a station. They approached him, questioned him, and although they didn't arrest him that day, they remembered him. Days later, another body was found. The same officers connected the dots. Chikatilo was brought in again, and this time, forensic evidence and witness reports trapped him. After days of interrogation, he confessed, not with remorse, but with an almost emotionless detachment, recounting each murder in cold, methodical detail. He admitted everything: the killings, the mutilations, the cannibalistic acts. His confession chilled even the most hardened investigators. His trial was one of the most shocking in Soviet history. He stood inside a cage, snarling, mocking, sometimes ranting, sometimes silent. Crowds outside demanded his death. Families of victims shouted at him, calling him a demon, a beast. And yet, inside the cage stood a man who looked ordinary, fragile even. Proof that evil doesn't always appear monstrous. In 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot behind the ear, ending the life of a man who had terrorized an entire nation. But the true horror of Chikatilo's story isn't just in the number of lives he stole. It's in how long he hid in plain sight, how easily he blended into the world around him, how a system meant to protect its people refused to acknowledge the existence of someone like him, and how a man shaped by fear, hunger, humiliation, and psychological torment transformed those scars into violence that destroyed countless families. Chikatilo remains one of the most chilling examples of how darkness can grow unnoticed, how a monster can wear the face of a quiet, unremarkable man, and how sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones nobody sees until it's too late.
Albert Fish. There are figures in the history of crime whose names feel like shadows, dark shapes lingering in the corners of society's memory. But then there are others whose stories feel almost too dark to belong to the real world. Albert Fish falls into that second category, a man whose appearance seemed harmless, almost invisible, yet whose actions would become some of the most disturbing ever documented. In the early decades of the 1900s, when America was still struggling through poverty, migration, and the echoes of the Industrial Revolution, Fish drifted through cities like a ghost, unnoticed, unthreatening, and entirely underestimated. When you look at photos of him, an elderly man with a gentle expression, a slim frame, a soft face, you would never think he was capable of anything beyond a quiet, solitary life. That contrast became one of the defining terrors of his case. How someone so ordinary could hide impulses so extraordinary in their darkness. And that is where the story truly begins, in the duality of faces, one for the world and one that no one was ever truly prepared to witness. Born in 1870 to a family already burdened by mental illness, Fish spent most of his childhood in and out of orphanages. These places were not the warm shelters they're imagined to be. They were harsh, violent institutions where cruelty became a daily language. For young Albert, it was a world that taught him two things. Pain was normal, and suffering was a companion. Many biographers believe these early experiences carved out pieces of him that would never heal. Slowly, something twisted took root, an obsession with punishment, with control, and with a kind of darkness he would later inflict on the world around him. As he grew older, Fish blended into society with surprising ease. He worked odd jobs, lived in boarding houses, raised children, attended church. Nothing about him screamed danger. And that invisibility became one of his greatest weapons. No one suspects the quiet old man. No one watches him closely. No one imagines that behind that kindness is a mind constructing fantasies so disturbing that even seasoned investigators later struggled to describe them. His crimes targeted the vulnerable, children, families living on the edge of poverty, households struggling to survive. Fish understood something about desperation. When people are trying to simply make ends meet, they rarely question kindness. They rarely suspect the stranger offering a job, a meal, or an opportunity for their child to help earn money. And Fish used that trust like a mask.
One of the most chilling aspects of his story wasn't just the crimes themselves, but the careful planning behind them. He didn't act in sudden rages or impulsive bursts. Instead, he observed, waited, studied routines, watched which family struggled, and then stepped in at the perfect moment. Soft-spoken, polite, reassuring. He presented himself as the kind of man you wouldn't mind watching your children for a few hours. That disarming quality would become central to the tragedy that followed. The most well-known case, the one that ultimately exposed him to the world, was the disappearance of 10-year-old Grace Budd. It began with a simple newspaper advertisement, a family offering work. A job meant food, hope, maybe a way out of hardship. Fish arrived at their door, dressed neatly, smiling politely, and claiming he had a steady-paying farm job for their teenage son. Everything about him radiated grandfatherly warmth. The Budds had no reason to doubt him. But on the day he was supposed to take the boy to this supposed job, Fish instead arrived with a new story. He mentioned a niece's birthday party, invited Grace along, and promised she'd be back by evening. The family, trusting, hopeful, agreed. It was a decision that would haunt them forever. What makes the Grace Budd case so haunting, even nearly a century later, is not only what happened to the child, but the chilling aftermath. For years, there were no clear answers, no body, no closure, only silence. Fish vanished once again into the background like fog dissolving into a city street. But then, in 1934, a letter arrived at the Budd residence. A letter written by Fish himself, the kind of letter that investigators later described as one of the most disturbing documents in criminal history. Not only because it revealed his involvement, but because it exposed the way his mind worked. He described in twisted detail the steps leading to Grace's disappearance, blending fact with delusion, cruelty with calmness, as though recounting a mundane event. It was this letter that finally shattered his anonymity and set detectives on his trail. It was also the moment the world realized it was dealing with something far beyond an ordinary monster. This was a man whose darkness reached into realms few could comprehend. The letter, fortunately, contained a small mistake, an envelope clue that allowed police to track him down. When they finally knocked on his door, Fish did not resist, did not deny, did not run. He simply nodded, spoke softly, and confessed as though relieved to finally be seen. Investigators were stunned by how polite, even gentle he seemed. It was the same unsettling contrast. A man who looked like anyone's aging neighbor, yet carried a mind that had drifted far past the limits of empathy. During his interrogation, he spoke almost casually about his acts, as though discussing memories of a life he no longer fully inhabited. Detectives realized they were dealing with someone whose psychological landscape was fractured beyond repair. A maze of trauma, obsession, and self-created fantasies. But despite his calmness, the courtroom would later reveal the true scope of his actions, painting a picture so horrific that even hardened professionals struggled to remain composed. Fish's trial in 1935 became a grim spectacle, half a legal proceeding, half psychological dissection. Experts debated whether he was insane, driven by delusions, or fully aware of his actions. The jury, unable to fathom letting him walk free on the grounds of insanity, declared him guilty. Their reasoning was simple. Some acts are so unimaginable that society cannot risk the possibility of their repetition. On January 16, 1936, at Sing Sing Prison, Albert Fish met the electric chair. Witnesses said he approached it calmly, almost peacefully, as though he had been expecting this ending all along. For some, that final walk offered a sliver of justice. For others, it felt far too small a consequence for the enormity of his crimes. Today, the story of Albert Fish stands as a chilling reminder that true horror often wears the most ordinary face. His legacy is not found in graphic details or sensational retellings, but in the quiet, unsettling truth that trust, once misplaced, can become a doorway to unimaginable darkness. In studying him, criminologists often say the same thing. That fish represents a rare, terrifying intersection of mental illness, trauma, and predatory intent. A man shaped by suffering, consumed by obsession, and ultimately remembered as one of the darkest figures in American criminal history. Even now, decades later, his story lingers, a whisper in the archives of true crime, a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are not the ones hiding under the bed, but the ones who knock politely on the door.
Armin Maiwes. In the quiet countryside of central Germany, in a village that looked more like a postcard than a place of infamy, stood a half-timbered farmhouse that would one day become the center of one of the strangest and most disturbing criminal cases ever recorded. Its shutters were faded, its yard silent, its presence almost forgotten among rolling hills and narrow roads. No one passing by would imagine that behind those walls lived a man who would shake the world with a story so surreal that many believed it was a hoax when first reported. His name was Armin Maiwes, a man who wanted something no one could comprehend and who found someone willing to give it. To understand how this case came to be, you have to understand the man at the center of it. Armin Maiwes was born in 1961, raised in a large but lonely home by a strict mother who controlled nearly every aspect of his life. His father walked out when Armin was just a boy, leaving behind a void that never seemed to close. That emptiness became the quiet background music of his entire childhood. While other children played outside, Armin spent most of his time indoors, wandering through empty rooms, talking to imaginary friends, and dreaming of companionship, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that blended need, fear, and fantasy. As he grew into adulthood, Armin remained socially isolated. He wasn't violent, he wasn't cruel, he wasn't outwardly dangerous. In fact, he was polite, soft-spoken, almost painfully ordinary. He worked as a computer technician, lived a stable life, and caused no trouble. Co-workers described him as the kind of man you'd never notice twice, and that in itself made what happened next even more chilling, because beneath that calm exterior was a desire he had carried since childhood, a desire to find someone who would be with him forever, someone who would never leave him the way his father had, a desire so unusual, so far from the realm of normal human longing that most people cannot even comprehend it. Armin didn't hide this fantasy. In the early days of the internet, where anonymity created entire underground worlds, he began visiting dark forums and niche chat rooms. These weren't places where ordinary conversations happened. These were corners of the web where people shared taboo fantasies, places where society's unspoken rules dissolved. And there, among usernames and hidden desires, Armin posted a message that would change everything. It was simple, shocking, and disturbingly polite. He was looking for a willing participant to become part of him forever. Most people would have dismissed such a message as a joke or the ramblings of someone unstable, but Armin wasn't joking. He was patient, he waited, and unbelievably, someone eventually replied. That man was Bernd Brandes, a German engineer from Berlin. Highly intelligent, successful in his career, a man who, on the surface, seemed the least likely person to engage with such a request. Yet Brandes carried his own secrets, his own shadows, his own long-buried impulses. The fact that he responded at all is one of the most unsettling pieces of this case. Two men, both isolated in different ways, both seeking something beyond human understanding, found each other in the vast, chaotic web of the early 2000s internet. Their conversations were meticulous, almost businesslike at times, detailing expectations, boundaries, and bizarre negotiations that still disturb investigators to this day. There was no deception, no coercion, no threats. Instead, it was a meeting of two dark desires that seemed to mirror each other in a way that made the entire situation feel unreal. In March of 2001, Brandes traveled to Armin's countryside home. The village of Wusterfeld had no idea what was unfolding within that quiet farmhouse. There was no screaming, no forced struggle, no chase, just two men willingly participating in a scenario too chilling for most to imagine. And while the details themselves are graphic and ethically complex, what matters for the story is the psychological weight behind it. One man who wanted to leave the world in an extraordinary way, and another who wanted to keep someone with him forever, literally. When the act itself was over, Armin did something that investigators still describe as one of the strangest parts of the case. He filmed the entire event, not out of cruelty, but out of a desire to document it as a personal memory, as if recording a significant moment in his life. Afterward, he cleaned the scene, stored what remained, and returned to his ordinary routine. He fed his pets. He went to work. He behaved as though nothing unusual had occurred. For months, Armin lived quietly, and he truly believed that what he had done wasn't a crime. After all, Brandes had volunteered, even insisted. The world, he thought, would never understand, but he saw himself not as a killer, but as a man fulfilling a mutual agreement. He even continued to visit online forums, calmly discussing what he had done with others, and that is what ultimately led to his arrest. Someone reported one of his online messages to police, assuming it was fiction. Investigators traced the IP address, arrived at his farmhouse, and what they found confirmed everything he had described online. The video recordings, the preserved remains, the detailed written agreements, it was all real. And Armin didn't deny any of it. He spoke openly, almost academically about the event, explaining his motives with a kind of eerie calm. The trial that followed became one of the most unusual in modern legal history. The central question wasn't whether Armin ended a life. He admitted that. The question was whether Brandes' consent mattered. Could someone volunteer for such an act? And if so, does that absolve the other person of guilt? Philosophers, psychologists, legal scholars, everyone weighed in. The trial became a global conversation about morality, agency, and the limits of human desire. Initially, Armin was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, because the act had been consensual. But the public was outraged. A second trial was ordered, and this time the court concluded that despite Brandes' consent, the act was morally and legally unacceptable. Armin Maiwes was sentenced to life in prison. Today, he remains behind bars, calm, articulate, even friendly in interviews. He has reportedly renounced his past fantasies and now works in the prison kitchen. But the case of Armin Maiwes continues to haunt psychologists and criminologists worldwide. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about loneliness, desire, and the strange paths a human mind can take when it feels truly isolated from the world. His story is not one of rage or cruelty. It is a story of emptiness, the kind so deep that it twisted into something unrecognizable. A story of two men whose paths crossed in the darkest corner of the internet, connecting through impulses both shared and forbidden. And ultimately, it is a story that reminds us that some of the most disturbing horrors don't happen out of hatred, but out of a longing that spiraled beyond anything human beings were ever meant to understand.
The Sawney Bean Clan. In the rugged, windswept coastline of 15th century Scotland, where the sea crashes endlessly against jagged cliffs and fog rolls thick over the land, there exists a legend so haunting that it has survived for centuries. A legend whispered around campfires, recited in old taverns, and recorded in some of the earliest crime pamphlets in British history. It is the story of a family so monstrous, so isolated from humanity, that even now historians debate whether they truly existed or whether they were a cautionary tale meant to frighten travelers into staying on the king's roads. But whether truth or myth, the name still sends a chill down the spine. The Sawney Bean Clan. The story begins with one man, Alexander, or Sawney Bean. Born into poverty, raised in a world where hunger, crime, and hardship shaped many lives. Some versions say he came from a family of manual laborers. Others say he simply rejected society altogether. What all versions agree on is this: Sawney Bean never wanted a normal life. He wasn't interested in honest work, nor in living among others. He dreamed instead of escaping the rules, escaping the taxes, escaping the authorities, escaping civilization itself. With the woman he met on the road, a woman rumored to be as ruthless as he was, Bean vanished into the harsh wilderness of Galloway. It was here, in a coastline carved by caves and tides, that the pair found something unusual: a massive, deep-sea cave whose entrance vanished underwater during high tide. To most people, it would have been a prison. To Sawney Bean, it was the perfect hiding place, a sanctuary far from prying eyes. What happened inside that cave over the next 25 years became the material of nightmares. As the story goes, Sawney and his partner built a life in total isolation, raising one child after another, who then raised children of their own. The Bean family grew into a clan, some say nearly 50 members in total. A clan that had no contact with the outside world, no teachers, no neighbors, no moral compass, no laws. Their world was the cave, the tithes, and each other. A society built on secrecy, self-sufficiency, and survival at any cost. The roads near their hidden home were dangerous, poorly lit, and rarely patrolled. Travelers passed through on horseback, merchants carried goods, and pilgrims wandered from town to town. Many never reached their destinations. People vanished in strange patterns, leaving behind abandoned horses, overturned carts, or broken wheels on the roadside. Entire families traveling together disappeared without a trace. At first, these incidents were blamed on bandits, wolves, floods, anything but the unimaginable truth. Villagers warned each other not to travel alone, not to travel at night, not to trust the silence of the moors, but still, people went missing. Suspicion grew sharper when the disappearances increased to the point of panic. Search parties combed forests and swamps, local inns were inspected, criminals were interrogated. But no matter how many torches were lit or how many squads of men marched through the hills, the search always came up empty. Whatever was taking people seemed invisible, or worse, everywhere. And then came the stories. Bodies washing ashore, mutilated beyond recognition, strange remains discovered in tidal pools. Theories spread like wildfire. Some whispered that the devil himself haunted the coast. Others believed a pack of monstrous, unnatural creatures roamed the wilderness. But none of these rumors were as terrifying as the truth that finally emerged. One evening, as the legend says, a married couple traveling by horseback was ambushed on a lonely road. The Bean clan emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, wild-eyed and feral from their years underground. The man fought back, desperately holding the attackers off long enough for a group of passers-by to arrive. For the first time in decades, the Beans had been seen, exposed, caught in the act by witnesses who survived. The survivors alerted authorities, and soon the news reached King James VI of Scotland. Furious and alarmed, the king assembled a massive search force: soldiers, trackers, bloodhounds, and local men familiar with every inch of the rugged landscape. Determined to end the mystery once and for all, they marched toward the area where the attacks had taken place. Hours turned into days as the search party swept through the wild terrain. But then,
one of the dogs caught a scent, a strange, pungent smell carried on the salty wind. The trail led the king's men along the coastline until they reached the mouth of a narrow cave, almost invisible from a distance. At low tide, it was just barely accessible. At high tide, it was sealed shut completely. Inside, the darkness was so thick that torches barely pierced it. But with every step deeper into that labyrinth, the truth became clearer. Tattered clothing, stolen jewelry, rusted weapons, and deeper still, the traces of what the Bean family had been doing to survive all those years. The discovery that would forever cement their place in legend. The soldiers found the clan, dozens of them, living in total darkness, surrounded by stolen goods from hundreds of victims. Their faces were gaunt, their behavior feral, their society more like a tribe of cave dwellers than human beings. The Beans did not resist at first. They were stunned by the invasion. Many had never seen daylight. Many had never seen strangers. Some had never seen anyone outside the family at all. What happened is told differently depending on the source. Some say the entire clan was taken alive, brought to Edinburgh, and executed for their crimes. Others say the soldiers, overwhelmed by the horrors of what they found, took justice into their own hands inside the cave. What is certain is that the cave was emptied and the disappearances stopped. The legend of Sawney Bean spread across Britain, entering folklore, courtroom speeches, and even early horror literature. Some historians argue the story is exaggerated, created by the English to portray Scots as savages. Others believe it contains fragments of truth, perhaps based on a real outlaw family that lived outside society's reach. But whether fact or myth, the Sawney Bean story carries a deeper meaning. It reflects society's fear of the unknown, of isolation, of communities that live beyond the edge of civilization. Because, in the end, the terror of the Sawney Bean clan isn't just in the crimes they allegedly committed. It's in the idea that a group of people could vanish from the world, build their own twisted society in darkness, and prey on the unsuspecting for decades, unseen, unquestioned, and unimagined. A reminder that sometimes the most frightening monsters aren't supernatural at all, but human beings who have stepped far outside the boundaries of the world we know.
The Donner Party. In the vast tapestry of American history, there are stories shaped by courage, ambition, and the unbreakable frontier spirit. But there are also stories where that same ambition collides with nature, leaving behind a haunting reminder of the thin line between survival and tragedy. And perhaps no tale captures this duality more powerfully than the story of the Donner Party, a group of ordinary families whose dream of a better life transformed into one of the darkest survival ordeals ever recorded. The year was 1846. The American West was still largely uncharted, a place of promise and peril, of golden landscapes and unforgiving mountains. Settlers from across the country packed their belongings into wooden wagons, tied oxen to yokes, and began the long journey along the Oregon and California trails. Among them were the Donners and the Reeds, two extended families from Illinois who believed California offered a future brighter than anything they left behind. They were kind, hardworking, hopeful people, and they had little idea of the storm that awaited them. At first, the journey west was almost idyllic. Days were spent under wide blue skies, nights beside campfires where children listened to stories of the wonders waiting beyond the horizon. The wagons rattled forward, families laughed together, and the Great Plains stretched endlessly ahead. But as the trail progressed, that optimism began to fade into something more cautious. The land turned harsher, the travel slower, and the weight of the unknown heavier. The turning point came when the Donner Party made a fateful decision, one that historians still debate today. They chose to take the Hastings Cutoff, an unproven short count promoted by a writer named Lansford Hastings, who claimed it would shave hundreds of miles off the journey. They believed him. They trusted the promise. And so instead of using the established trail, they turned south toward the Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. The problem? The cutoff wasn't a shortcut at all. It was a trap. Almost immediately, the terrain grew brutal. Dense forests, steep canyons, and rugged mountain passages slowed the wagons to a crawl. Trees had to be cut, rocks cleared, paths forged by hand. Instead of saving time, they lost weeks. The sun grew harsher, supplies dwindled, tempers snapped. Livestock began to die from exhaustion. And then came the desert. The Great Salt Lake Desert was a shimmering expanse of pale earth and scorching heat, a place where the horizon blends with the sky and shadows disappear. The families attempted to cross it believing it was 40 miles wide. It was actually closer to 80. The heat scorched their skin, the wide ends sunk into salt-crusted mud, and the animals, terrified and dehydrated, collapsed. When they finally reached the other side, the wagons were damaged, their food stores dangerously low, and many families were already broken in spirit. But turning back was impossible. As the Donner Party pushed forward toward the Sierra Nevada, winter crept closer. They knew the mountains could only be crossed before snow arrived. Once the passes closed, no one got through until spring. They raced against time, pushing their exhausted animals harder, rationing cornmeal and biscuits, praying that the first snowfall would come late that year. It didn't. In the final days of October, winter struck with sudden fury. Snow fell so fast and so deep that it erased the trail in a matter of hours. The passes vanished under white walls of ice. Trees snapped under the weight. The Donner Party was trapped. They were stranded at the edge of the Sierra Nevada, surrounded by forests so quiet they felt haunted. Some members made it to the eastern end of Lake Tahoe, building crude shelters at what would become known as the Truckee Lake Camp. Others, including the Donners themselves, were stuck miles behind, forced to build makeshift cabins out of snow, hides, and broken wagons. As days turned into weeks, the snow only grew deeper. Oxen froze in place. Supplies ran out. The cold became an enemy that seeped into bones, into dreams, into hope itself. Families burned furniture just to stay alive through the nights. Hunger gnawed at every thought. The silence of the mountains became suffocating. With no way forward and no way back, they faced a terrible reality. No one was coming for them. Not yet. And not soon. In desperation, a group of the strongest members, later called the Forlorn Hope, attempted to walk out of the mountains in search of help. They carried a small amount of food, makeshift snowshoes, and a hope that the world beyond the mountains hadn't forgotten them. Storms battered them relentlessly. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others grew delirious. The line between life and death blurred under the white sky. When the survivors of that group finally stumbled into a settlement, half frozen and half conscious, their arrival shocked the residents. Their clothes were shredded, their faces hollow, their ordeal beyond words. But they carried news that ignited California into action. Dozens of people, men, women, and children, were still trapped in the mountains. Rescue parties were formed immediately, but reaching the camps was nearly impossible. They were buried under thick blankets of snow, hidden in woods where even landmarks had disappeared. When rescuers arrived, they found scenes of unimaginable hardship. Families huddled together in dark cabins, snow piled so high it blocked the doors. Children too weak to speak, parents too exhausted to stand. It took 4 separate rescue missions to bring out the survivors. Each group that returned carried fewer people, each journey marked by heartbreaking choices, bitter storms, and the slow realization that not everyone could be saved. Some tried to walk out with rescuers but collapsed on the trail. Others refused to leave sick family members behind. A few simply couldn't endure another hour of winter. By the time spring finally melted the snow and the mountains revealed their secrets, 47 members of the Donner Party were dead. 48 survived.
forever changed, scarred in ways most of them never spoke about again. Today, the story of the Donner Party is often remembered for its darkest chapter. But beyond the survival, beyond the fear, there is something else. A tragic lesson about human ambition, blind trust, and the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier. It is a reminder that nature doesn't bend to hope, that shortcuts can carry devastating consequences, and that the line between life and loss can vanish beneath the weight of a single early snowfall. Standing at Donner Lake today, surrounded by peaceful trees and calm water, it is almost impossible to imagine the horror that unfolded there. But the winds still whisper through the pines, and the mountains still stand silent, eternal witnesses to a story of courage, desperation, and the terrible cost of survival in the frozen heart of the Sierra Nevada.
The Canterbury Cannibal. In the quiet English county of Kent, where centuries-old churches stand watch over narrow lanes and marketplaces glow softly under evening lanterns, there exists a story that clashes violently with its peaceful surroundings. A story so surreal, so disturbing, and so rooted in the darkest corners of the human mind that it stunned an entire nation when it emerged. This is the strange and unsettling case of Dale Bollinger, a man the media would come to call the Canterbury Cannibal. To understand this case, you first have to understand how deceptively ordinary the man at its center appeared. Dale Bollinger wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in back alleys or hiding on the outskirts of society. He was a trained nurse, a husband, a father. He lived in a modest home on a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where neighbors wave politely and children play outside. To anyone who passed him in the supermarket or saw him riding his bicycle around town, he looked harmless, even friendly. The banality of his appearance makes the story that follows all the more disturbing. Bollinger's life, at least on the surface, appeared steady and predictable, but beneath that calm exterior was a man spiraling deeper and deeper into a world completely removed from reality, a world built on dark fantasies, anonymous usernames, and online spaces where taboo desires were traded like currency. It was the early 2010s, a time when hidden corners of the internet were exploding with conversations no one dared have in the real world. And it was in these corners that Bollinger found an environment where no one questioned him, no one judged, no one said stop. He began gravitating toward fetish forums and underground chat rooms, places populated by people who, behind the safety of anonymity, confessed fantasies that seemed impossible, immoral, or outright delusional. Most people visited these spaces out of curiosity or imagination, but Bollinger wasn't content with fantasy. Over time, his online persona began drifting into something more serious, more actionable. And that was where the story crossed from bizarre to criminal. Under the username Moody Blues, Bollinger communicated with individuals who claimed to share his darkest impulses. Conversations flowed freely, without restraint, as though the digital world had dissolved the boundaries of common sense. What disturbed investigators most years later wasn't just what he said, but how calmly he said it. His tone was cold, matter-of-fact, stripped of emotion, a professional describing procedure, rather than a man slipping into dangerous obsession. Then came the message that would eventually bring the entire case crashing into the real world. Bollinger began communicating with someone he believed to be a 14-year-old girl. She wasn't real. She was an undercover FBI agent investigating online predators. But Bollinger didn't know that, and what he shared with her went far beyond inappropriate conversations. He planned meetings. He described fantasies in chilling detail. He discussed with disturbing sincerity ideas that investigators later said had crossed every imaginable line. Most terrifying of all, he attempted to act on his fantasies in ways that revealed he was far more than a daydreaming fantasist.
One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from a purchase he made in 2010. He walked into a store in Canterbury, approached the counter calmly, and bought a 12-inch axe. To the shopkeeper, he was just another customer. To investigators later reviewing the case, it became a symbol, a physical step into the world he had been constructing online. It proved intent, it proved preparation, and it destroyed any claim that he was merely seeking attention on the internet. Meanwhile, Bollinger maintained his normal life. He worked shifts in nursing homes, he greeted coworkers politely, he treated patients with professionalism and care. No one suspected anything. And that duality, the nurse caring for the vulnerable by day and engaging in dark fantasies by night, created a portrait that horrified the public once his secret life was exposed. What finally brought him down wasn't a single dramatic moment, but the slow tightening of an investigative net that had been spreading across continents. Because the undercover agent posing as the teenage girl was part of an American investigation, US authorities contacted their British counterparts. The case then shifted to Kent police, who began quietly gathering evidence. They monitored his online activity, documented his purchases, tracked his communications, and built a picture of a man whose inner world had detached from reality entirely. When officers finally showed up at his home in 2012, Bollinger didn't flee. He didn't protest. In fact, he seemed strangely resigned, as though he knew that the world he had been building online had finally collapsed under its own weight. Inside the house, police found the computer that had been his portal into fantasy, along with journals and notes that painted a clear picture of a man whose obsessions had grown stronger than his grip on reality. The trial that followed was a disturbing glimpse into the intersection of fantasy and criminal intent. Prosecutors argued that Bollinger represented a danger to anyone vulnerable, particularly minors. They emphasized that while no actual physical crime had taken place, the intent was real, the preparations were real, and his willingness to act had already been proven. The defense attempted to portray him as mentally unstable, suggesting that his behavior was rooted in psychological deterioration rather than malice. But the jury was unmoved. They saw the conversations, they read the transcripts, they viewed the evidence, and in 2014, Dale Bollinger was sentenced to 9 years in prison. His case instantly became infamous, not just because of what he planned, but because of how easily he hid in plain sight. A reminder that the most disturbing figures are sometimes the ones who look ordinary. Even after his conviction, the public struggled to make sense of how a man entrusted to care for others could harbor such darkness. Experts say his case highlights a dangerous truth about the digital age, that online anonymity can create echo chambers where harmful fantasies grow unchecked, reinforced by others who encourage them. For Bollinger, the internet not only allowed him to express his fantasies, it convinced him they were normal, validated, even possible. Today, the Canterbury Cannibal case serves as a chilling example of how the distance between thought and action can shrink in the shadows of the online world. It's a reminder that evil does not always come in monstrous form. Sometimes it wears a polite smile. Sometimes it works in hospitals. Sometimes it lives in quiet English towns where no one suspects a thing. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is not what Bollinger planned, but how close he came to making those plans real.
Dr. Alfredo Bailly Trevino. In the quiet city of Monterrey, Mexico, the late 1950s were a time of stillness, a place where the desert winds whispered through the streets and life moved with a kind of slow, predictable rhythm. But hidden beneath that calm surface was a story that would later echo across the world, a story that would inspire one of the most chilling fictional characters of all time. At the center of it stood a young, respected physician.
His name was Dr. Alfredo Bailly Trevino, and to his community, he was everything a doctor should be: polite, meticulous, soft-spoken. No one imagined that behind those calm eyes was a darkness deeper than anyone could have predicted. Trevino wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleyways. He wasn't a drifter or a violent criminal known to police. He was educated, elegant, and impossibly composed. And maybe that's what made the truth so disturbing. Evil doesn't always come snarling. Sometimes it wears a white coat, speaks gently, and smiles kindly. In his clinic, Trevino was known for his steady hands and almost surgical precision. But those same hands would become the center of a crime so disturbing that even hardened investigators struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The events began with a man named Jesus Castillo Rangel, a young medical student and Trevino's close friend. Some say his lover, others say merely an associate. Whatever their relationship truly was, it ended violently one night in 1959. According to court records, an argument broke out between the two men. What exactly was said behind the closed door of Trevino's clinic remains unknown, but something pushed the doctor over an invisible line, and once he crossed it, there was no coming back. The killing itself shocked the authorities, not just because a respected doctor had done it, but because of the chilling precision with which he handled the aftermath. Trevino did not panic. He did not flee. Instead, he approached the scene with a cold, methodical calm, the same calm he used during surgery. He prepared tools. He worked slowly. He worked carefully. For investigators, it was the clinical nature of the act that made them realize they weren't dealing with a crime of passion, they were dealing with something else entirely. When the police discovered the body, they were confronted with something unlike anything they had seen. While details were kept from the public and remain partially sealed even today, the officers involved described the scene as surgically altered. It was enough to earn Trevino a chilling reputation, a healer who had used his medical knowledge in a way no one expected. Rumors began to spread, rumors of cannibalism, of medical experimentation, of a doctor who had stepped into complete moral darkness. And like all frightening rumors, they grew louder because there wasn't enough information to silence them. When he was eventually arrested, Trevino did not act like a man terrified of punishment. He sat quietly. He answered questions. He behaved like someone who fully understood what he had done, yet didn't seem disturbed by it. The strange calm he radiated unnerved investigators. They were used to killers who trembled or lashed out in denial. Trevino did neither. It was as if he had mentally dissected the outcome long before he ever committed the act. In 1961, Dr. Alfredo Bailly Trevino was sentenced to death. For many, that should have been the end of the story, a brief, disturbing chapter in Monterrey's history. But this is where the tale takes an unexpected turn. While awaiting punishment in prison, Trevino crossed paths with a young American journalist researching violent crime across Latin America. That journalist was Thomas Harris, the future author of The Silence of the Lambs. Standing face to face with the young doctor left an impression on Harris unlike anything he had experienced. His politeness, his intelligence, his eerie blend of warmth and coldness, all of it fused into the seed of a fictional character the world would later fear, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. The similarities are unmistakable. A brilliant physician, cultured, articulate, with a facade of refinement wrapped tightly around something horrifyingly empty. Harris never explicitly confirmed Trevino as the sole inspiration for Lecter, but he strongly hinted at it, and researchers have connected the dots ever since. Yet Trevino's story didn't end with death row. In a surprising move, his death sentence was overturned due to legal irregularities, and he was instead given a long prison term. While incarcerated, Trevino didn't behave like the monster the public imagined. Instead, he helped treat other inmates. He offered medical advice. He stayed quiet and calm. Over time, he even earned a strange form of respect among prisoners. Not affection, but recognition of his intelligence and skill. And then, in 1981, something even more unexpected happened. He was released. The doctor once feared, whispered about, and thought to be a living nightmare stepped back into society. But he didn't return to violence. He lived quietly. Some say he opened a small clinic and treated low-income patients. Others say he kept mostly to himself, a ghost of the man he once was. Whatever the truth, he lived peacefully until 2009, the year he died. Even in death, he remained an enigma, a man capable of both healing and horrifying. What makes the story of Dr. Alfredo Bailly Trevino especially chilling isn't the crime itself, it's the contradiction. He was a man trusted with life, yet capable of cold, surgical death. A man whose calmness was more terrifying than anger. A man who slipped between roles, doctor, killer, healer, as if each were a mask he could put on whenever the moment required. To many, Trevino's life is a reminder that evil isn't always chaotic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's intelligent. Sometimes it sits across from you, smiling politely, asking you if you're feeling better. And that idea, the idea that darkness can hide behind intelligence and composure, is what keeps his story alive, decades after his crimes. Today, his legacy exists in two worlds: the real world, where his crime left a ripple of fear through Monterey, and the fictional world, where his presence helped to shape one of cinema's most iconic monsters. And maybe that's the final unsettling truth. Sometimes reality is what teaches fiction how to frighten us.
The French famine cannibals. In the early 11th century, long before Europe knew the Renaissance, long before kingdoms rose and fell with the rhythm of empires, there came a year the chroniclers called the Year of the Horrors. That year was 1033, a time when the land of France, then a patchwork of feudal territories, seemed cursed by forces far beyond human understanding. It was a winter without mercy, a spring without rebirth, and a summer without life. And as crops failed and livestock died, a strange, awful silence took hold of the countryside. It was the silence of hunger, the kind that devours the soul long before it ever touches the body. The famine is believed to have been triggered by a chain of climatic events: relentless rains, ruined harvests, and temperatures that refused to rise. But in those days, people didn't blame the weather. They blamed the heavens. Many believed the famine was a sign of the approaching apocalypse. Priests preached that God had turned his face away. Villagers whispered that the end of days was unfolding before their eyes. That fear wasn't metaphorical, it was real, it was raw, and it shaped every desperate act that followed. By the time the crisis reached its peak, entire villages were barely recognizable. Homes stood abandoned, fields lay drowned and blackened. People wandered the roads like ghosts, wrapped in rags, their faces hollow and eyes sunken into their skulls. Chroniclers describe them as walking skeletons, barely alive, moving not with purpose, but with instinct. The instinct to survive one more day, one more hour, one more breath. At first, the desperate ate whatever they could find: bark, twigs, roots, even the leather from shoes and belts. But the famine did not ease. It deepened, it grew teeth, and like many famines throughout history, it pushed human beings to a threshold they never imagined they would cross.
Reports from monks and priests, some horrified, some strangely calm in their record-keeping, told of a reality so grim that even centuries later, historians struggle to comprehend its scale. According to these accounts, the starving began digging into the frozen ground of cemeteries. The dead, once laid to rest with prayers and reverence, became something else entirely, the last available source of sustenance. These accounts were not written with exaggeration or theatrical fear. They were recorded with the cold, steady voice of men witnessing the collapse of the world around them. One chronicler wrote of families, once proud and prosperous, reduced to haunting graveyards at night, pulling bodies from shallow earth. Another recorded that some villages vanished entirely, their people consumed by the famine or by one another. Some historians argue these tales were symbolic, meant to warn of sin and punishment. But the consistency of the records, written in different regions by different hands, suggests these events were not metaphor, they were reality. Imagine the world from their eyes, churches ringing bells not in celebration but in mourning, days stretching endlessly without food, nights colder than memory, and the ever-present knowledge that death was creeping closer with every passing moment. In that environment, morality didn't vanish, it crumbled. It decayed like the world around it. But what makes the story of the 1033 famine so haunting isn't just the cannibalism itself. It's what came after. As the worst months wore on, rumors began spreading from village to village, rumors of groups who had stopped waiting for death, who had stopped fearing sin, who traveled the countryside searching not just for the dead, but for the living. Chroniclers wrote of bands of starved individuals who had abandoned all restraint. Whether those tales were true, exaggerated, or born from collective fear is still debated, but the fact that people believed them shows the psychological devastation that famine had carved into the land. Some communities responded with harsh measures. Anyone caught near cemeteries at night could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Villagers formed watch groups, patrolling burial grounds with torches. It wasn't just about protecting the dead, it was about protecting the living from the terror of what desperation can create. The famine lasted months, but for many it felt like years. And when it finally ended, when the rains eased, when new seeds survived the soil, when livestock repopulated, France was not the same. The survivors emerged gaunt, haunted, changed. They walked through the ruins of their old lives with a quietness that history often overlooks. Trauma in those days wasn't understood, it wasn't written about, but it lived in the eyes of every man, woman, and child who survived the winter of 1033. The church later described the famine as a divine test. Some poets called it a punishment. Historians today see it as one of the clearest examples of how environmental disaster can reshape not just the land, but the very soul of a society. But for the people who lived through it, there were no metaphors, just cold, hunger, and choices no human being should ever have to make. Even now, nearly a millennium later, the chronicles remain eerily vivid. They speak of roads lined with abandoned carts, of cities that shut their gates to the starving, of priests who tried desperately to feed the masses until their stores ran dry. And above all, they speak of the cemetery grounds, once holy spaces transformed into grim symbols of survival. Those walking skeletons, as the chronicles called them, were not monsters. They were not villains. They were human beings pushed past the breaking point. And that might be the most terrifying part of the story. Not the cannibalism itself, but the reminder that beneath the polished surface of civilization lies a truth we often try to forget. Hunger, true hunger, is stronger than fear, stronger than morality, even stronger than faith. When historians look back on the famine of 1033, They see a tragedy carved into the foundation of medieval Europe. But when we look back, we see something deeper, a moment in history when people were forced to confront the darkest corners of human survival. A moment when the boundary between humanity and desperation vanished. A moment when the dead no longer rested and the living no longer lived, but simply endured. And perhaps that is why the story of the French famine cannibals still lingers today, not as a tale of horror, but as a stark warning of how fragile the human world truly is.
The year was 1892, a time when the polar regions of the world were still unmapped mysteries, places whispered about in scientific circles and feared by sailors who knew what the Arctic could do to a human being. This was an era of bold exploration, when nations competed to carve their names into the blank white spaces on the map. But in their hunger for discovery, many explorers underestimated the thing that ruled the Arctic more absolutely than any king: the cold. A cold so complete, so merciless, that it could reshape both the land and the people trapped within it. It was during this age of ambition that a group of men set out on a mission that would soon turn into one of the most disturbing survival stories of the century. Their expedition's goal was deceptively simple: travel into the northern wilderness, document the terrain, and establish a route that might be used by future explorers. But the Arctic is never simple. It is a place where the environment is not just hostile, it is predatory. The group consisted of trappers, traders, and frontiersmen, men familiar with hardship, men who believed they knew what it meant to endure. They traveled north into the cold interior of the Canadian Arctic, expecting freezing temperatures, but unaware of the storm that would soon swallow them. As winter tightened its grip, their supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. The wildlife they depended on for food vanished. Ice walls grew higher, winds cut through clothing like glass, and storms pinned them inside their makeshift shelters for days. This was a time before modern rescue operations, before satellite tracking, before radios could call for help. Once you entered the Arctic, you were alone, and the deeper the men traveled into that frozen labyrinth, the more alone they became. By late winter, hunger wasn't a discomfort. It was a companion. It crept into their bones, made their hands tremble, and clouded their minds. Their bodies burned through energy they no longer had, and soon even walking became slow and agonizing. The men tried everything to find food: traps, long treks across icy plains, attempts to fish through frozen lakes, but the Arctic gave them nothing. Then came the freezing winds so strong they ripped tents apart and buried supplies beneath sudden drifts of snow. The men packed up and moved again, hoping to reach a known trading post miles away. But in the whiteout, they grew disoriented. Landmarks disappeared. Days began blending together. And slowly, one by one, some of the men collapsed, unable to continue. It was here, in this moment of confusion and despair, that the expedition crossed the invisible line between survival and horror. When rescuers eventually found the survivors months later, they listened to the men's testimonies with disbelief. They heard how the storms had worsened, how the group splintered, how attempts to hunt failed again and again. They heard how choices were made that would never be spoken aloud in polite society. The rescuers noted the starving faces of the survivors, the silence in their voices, the way they avoided direct eye contact when describing their last weeks out on the ice. Rumors began spreading. Rumors of what starving men had done when the Arctic stripped them of everything. Not just warmth and food, but reason. Reports said the men turned to the only resource that remained. Not out of cruelty, not out of malice, but out of the same primal instinct that kept early humans alive during the prehistoric winters that reshaped humanity. The press later called it the 1892 Arctic mass cannibalism, but the survivors called it something else entirely: the cost of staying alive. One of the most unsettling elements of this tragedy was how quickly the situation escalated once hunger breached a certain threshold. According to accounts, the dead did not die suddenly, they faded. Hypothermia, starvation, exhaustion, each man was weakening long before he fell. And when he finally did, the others were forced to confront the question that every survival tale tries to avoid. What would you do if it meant living one more day? What separates this event from many other Arctic disasters is the aftermath. When the survivors returned to civilization, they were not greeted with applause or sympathy. They were met with horror, suspicion, and moral outrage. Newspapers published sensational headlines. Citizens debated whether the men should be pitied or condemned. And clergy declared that the Arctic had revealed the darkest parts of human nature. But the survivors remained quiet. They did not defend themselves, nor did they justify what happened. Many refused to speak of the expedition ever again. They carried the weight of those months into the rest of their lives, a silent shadow that followed them long after the physical wounds had healed. Historians studying the event often remark that what happened in 1892 was not unique. Arctic explorers from the Franklin expedition to the Greely expedition had faced similar horrors. But the 1892 incident stands out because of the psychological collapse recorded among the survivors. Their journals, sparse, fragmented, written with shaking hands, show how fear, cold, and hunger did not just break their bodies, they fractured their sense of reality. Some entries describe the Arctic as a living force, a presence watching them, waiting for them to fail. Others described vivid hallucinations, seeing food where there was none, hearing footsteps outside the camp when no one was there, feeling watched by the endless walls of ice. One survivor wrote, "The silence is the worst. It is not empty. It presses upon us. It listens." Whether these descriptions were hallucinations or the poetic expressions of starving men, one thing is certain. The Arctic had stripped them of everything except the instinct to cling to life. When we look back at the 1892 Arctic mass cannibalism, we often focus on the horror of the final acts. But the real horror lies in everything that came before, the slow unraveling of hope, the endless cold, the isolation, the knowledge that no help was coming. These men were not villains. They were not monsters. They were human beings trapped in a landscape where nature does not compromise. Their story is a reminder that extreme environments do not just test human strength, they test human morality. And sometimes, in the quiet, merciless expanse of the Arctic, survival demands choices the civilized world refuses to understand. The 1892 tragedy stands as a stark testament to the brutal truth of exploration. The greatest danger is not what you discover, but what you become when the world around you disappears.
Fritz Haarmann. In the years following World War I, Germany was a nation suspended between ruin and recovery. Streets were heavy with unemployment, hunger, and uncertainty. And in the city of Hanover, a place once known for its tidy markets and quiet neighborhoods, a different kind of darkness was waiting to emerge. It didn't come from the political turmoil, nor from the poverty that stalked the working class. It came from a man who walked those same streets with a smile, a handshake, and a strange, disarming charm. His name was Fritz Haarmann, and his crimes would one day cast a shadow so large that the city itself struggled to escape it. Haarmann didn't look like a monster. In fact, that was part of the problem. He was friendly, approachable, and oddly comforting in an era when most people were exhausted by hardship. He sold secondhand clothing at the market, greeted neighbors politely, and even worked informally with the local police as an informant. If anyone had suspected the horrors happening inside his apartment, they never let the thought linger long. Evil, in their minds, didn't mingle in crowds. It hid in the dark. It wore a snarl, not a smile. But Haarmann understood something most people didn't. Trust is a doorway, And once you hold the key, you can walk into anyone's life without resistance. His victims were mostly young men, runaways, drifters, and the homeless youth of a broken post-war Germany. They arrived in Hanover desperate for food, work, or simply escape. And Harmon, with his warm voice and promises of meals and shelter, knew exactly how to appear like a savior. Witnesses later said he seemed almost fatherly, a man who offered hope in a time that had very little to give. The truth behind his kindness was something investigators would struggle to comprehend for years. Harmon had a particular talent. He could blend into any social situation. He chatted effortlessly with police, who saw him as a useful ally. He navigated the criminal underworld without drawing suspicion. He walked through crowds unnoticed because nothing about him seemed threatening. But inside the quiet corners of his mind lived a darkness shaped by isolation, trauma, and impulses he kept hidden beneath layers of charm. The first disappearances were barely noticed. In 1918, 1919, and 1920, young men drifted through Hanover like leaves carried by the wind. People lost track of them, families assumed they had moved on in search of work. But by 1923, the pattern became impossible to ignore. At the Line River, the calm, winding waterway that cut through Hanover, fishermen began finding fragments of human remains, not whole bodies, just pieces, enough to rattle the public and enough to terrify the police into acknowledging that something horrific was happening. Rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered of a madman living along the riverbanks, a beast that hunted at night. Authorities searched the water, the streets, the abandoned warehouses, but they found nothing that pointed to a killer. Nothing except the evidence that the dead were piling up somewhere in the city. The breakthrough came almost by accident. A young man reported escaping an attack, and the attacker, he claimed, was none other than Fritz Harmon. At first, police hesitated. Harmon was their informant, after all, a man they had shared cigarettes and jokes with, a man who had provided useful information for years. But something about the victim's fear, something about his trembling insistence, convinced them to investigate. What they discovered inside Harmon's apartment would haunt Hanover for generations. Authorities entered his home expecting to find stolen goods, maybe weapons, perhaps evidence of assault. Instead, they found clothes, piles and piles of clothing from missing boys, shoes stacked in corners, belts folded neatly in drawers, items that families later identified as belonging to sons who had vanished months earlier. They were stains, too, and smells that didn't belong in a normal home. And neighbors, when questioned, confessed something strange. The butcher shops nearby rarely received bones from Harmon, but he often had meat to sell, more than anyone expected a man living alone to possess. Although investigations avoided graphic detail, they made one thing horrifically clear. Harmon had used his apartment as both a hunting ground and a disposal site. It was a place where the line between life and death disappeared behind a locked door. When Harmon was finally confronted, he didn't flee, he didn't deny, he simply sighed, as if the weight of years had finally become too much, and began confessing with a calmness that drained the room of any illusion of humanity. He spoke of his crimes in a flat, emotionless tone, as if recounting chores rather than atrocities. Investigators describe the interviews as some of the most unsettling moments of their careers, not because of what Harmon said, but because of how he said it. There was no rage, no despair, no madness in his voice, only a cold, clinical acceptance of what he had done. The public's reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers called him the Butcher of Hanover. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, demanding answers the police could barely provide. Families of missing boys arrived from across the country, praying their sons were not among the victims, yet fearing that they were. Hanover, once a quiet city,
became a place trembling with grief, outrage, and disbelief. At his trial in 1924, Harmon remained composed. He answered questions plainly, he didn't argue, he didn't defend. When asked why he committed the crimes, his response was chilling in its simplicity. He didn't know. Something inside him wanted control, possession, closeness. Desires twisted by loneliness and pathology until they became unrecognizable. He was convicted of 24 murders, though investigators believed the real number was far higher. Some estimates suggest more than 40 victims. Others say the true count will never be known, lost in the war-scarred records of a shattered Germany. Harmon was executed in 1925. His final moments were calm, almost eerily peaceful. And when the city learned he was dead, there was no celebration, only relief. Heavy and exhausted, like a storm that had finally blown itself out. Today, Fritz Harmon's story remains one of the darkest chapters in German history. It is a tale that forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Monsters do not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they walk beside us in daylight, smiling politely, shaking hands, and offering help. And sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one no one ever suspects.
The German World War II cannibal train. Imagine a winter so brutal it seems to silence the world. Snow swallowing the landscape, wind carving through bone. And through this frozen wasteland, crawling slowly across the tracks like a dying steel serpent, was a train. A train that would later become one of the darkest, least spoken tragedies of the Second World War. Whispered about in military diaries, muttered by survivors decades later, and finally pieced together by historians who tried to understand how an entire string of carriages descended into something unthinkable. Today, we explore the German World War II cannibal train, a story drenched in desperation, isolation, and a horrifying collapse of human order. Our journey begins in the winter of 1943-44, deep on the Eastern Front, where the brutality of war had reached levels few in Europe had ever witnessed. German forces were retreating, supply lines snapping, entire battalions being swallowed by snow and Soviet advances. Among the chaos, a special evacuation train was assembled, packed with wounded soldiers, frostbitten conscripts, civilian refugees, and scattered military staff trying to flee the collapsing front. It was supposed to travel west, away from the approaching Soviet hammer. But the reality would be far worse. The train would never reach safety, and the horrors inside would eclipse the battlefields outside. From the moment the train departed, things began going wrong. Engineers warned that many engines were failing in the cold. Supplies were disastrously low. The snowstorms growing heavier by the day turned the tracks into icy tombs. And as the days passed, the locomotive slowed, then stalled, then finally died somewhere in the endless white void between outposts. There were no friendly towns nearby, no reinforcements coming, no working radios. Only snow, silence, and the rising panic of hundreds trapped within iron walls. Inside the train, the atmosphere began shifting quickly. At first, people waited patiently, convinced help would arrive. Fires were lit in metal cans for warmth. Bandages were checked. Mothers held their children close. Soldiers tried to maintain order, promising everyone that the stoppage was temporary. But as the long frozen nights stretched into another day and then another, the thin layer of military discipline began to crack. Food, already dangerously scarce, vanished first. What little was left, scraps of bread, frozen potatoes, half-rotten field rations, was rationed to the point of absurdity. People melted snow for water. Hunger deepened into something sharp, something that clawed at the mind. People grew weaker, arguments broke out, and those who had once marched proudly under the German flag found themselves reduced to begging, clinging to any hope that rescue was on the way. But rescue never came. By the 4th or 5th day, accounts vary, the first deaths occurred. Exposure, illness, shock, the cold claimed its victims quietly. Their bodies stiffened in the corners of the freezing compartments. Normally, in war, fallen comrades are honored, buried, named. But here, surrounded by nothing but white emptiness, even the rituals of death began to dissolve. The bodies stayed on the train, wrapped in blankets or left lying on benches, and hunger continued to tighten its grip. It's in that tightening agony that the legend and the horror begins. Survivors, whispering years later, spoke of the moment when someone, nobody can agree who, broke the barrier no one thought would ever be crossed. Whether it was an act of madness, of instinct, or of pure desperation, we'll never know. But slowly, quietly, the taboo fractured. What started with a few terrified, starving passengers soon spread like a macabre contagion through the train. By the time chaos fully emerged, leadership had collapsed. People barricaded themselves inside compartments, afraid not only of the cold, but of each other. In one haunting account, a former soldier said the silence of the train was the worst part, a silence broken only by the wind howling outside and the faint, fearful shuffling of those still alive. Another described how the windows were completely frosted over, making the world outside look like nothing existed beyond the thin pane of glass. It created a feeling of being trapped between life and death, as if the whole train had slipped out of reality and into some frozen purgatory. As the days dragged on, more passengers died. Some from cold, some from starvation, some simply gave up, closing their eyes and exhaling their final clouds of white breath. And somewhere in that descent, people stopped thinking of the train as a vehicle or a refuge or even a place. Instead, it became its own world, a bleak, savage micro-civilization where every rule of normal human life had rotted away. By the time the train was finally discovered, abandoned in the snow, half buried like a fossilized monster, the rescuers were not prepared for what they found. Reports were hushed, records buried. The details became the kind of thing officers discussed behind closed doors, the kind of thing that embarrassed even the brutal machinery of war. The official statements were vague. Mass death due to conditions, train lost in winter terrain, casualties caused by exposure. But the soldiers who first boarded those frozen carriages told a different story. One of madness, starvation, and the unimaginable things desperation can drive a human being to do. The mystery only deepened after the war. Many documents related to Eastern Front evacuations were destroyed, leaving gaps historians still struggle to fill. Some believe the cannibal train story was exaggerated, a ghost tale born from wartime trauma. Others say it was only one of several such incidents. But almost all experts agree. The conditions along the retreat from Russia, especially in the winters of 1943-44, created situations where normal human behavior broke down entirely. And so the cannibal train drifts through history like a nightmare frozen in time, half fact, half cursed legend. A reminder that the most terrifying horrors of war don't always happen on the battlefields. Sometimes they happen in the quiet, in the cold, in those forgotten corners where desperation devours humanity piece by piece. A steel coffin stranded in a white desert, a train filled with people who simply wanted to survive, and a story that forces us to confront the darkest question of all. How far would a human go when the world abandons them?